The radio crackled with static, then that automated voice again. Third time in an hour. Emergency alert, Liberty Island under full quarantine. I turned it off and went back to staring at the 3 overdue bills spread across my kitchen table. Coned, cable, and something from the city about property taxes that I'd been ignoring for 2 months. Nothing I didn't already know about the radio alert, and frankly, nothing that was going to help me figure out why my pension checks were going to stop coming if I didn't get on that Coast Guard cutter in 20 minutes. The call had come in at 6:30 this morning, jarring me out of the first decent sleep I'd had in weeks. Some federal type with a voice like processed cheese, telling me I was needed for immediate consultation on an active situation. When I'd pointed out that I wasn't a consultant, wasn't active, and hadn't been needed for anything more complicated than jury duty in 3 years, he'd gotten that edge in his voice that bureaucrats get when they're about to make your life complicated. Detective Hale, this is a matter of national security. Transport will arrive at your location in 30 minutes. Ex-detective, I'd said, but he'd already hung up. Marcus Hale, they said when they called. Like I forgot my own damn name. Detective first grade, retired 3 years now after 32 on the force, though I kept telling people it was 31. Didn't want to sound like I'd overstayed my welcome. Truth was, I'd been ready to leave 5 years before I did. Maybe 10. Sarah always said I had a problem with commitment, and she was right about that. Just wrong about which direction the problem went. Now I was living in a 1-bedroom in Astoria, trying to make retirement work on a pension that barely covered rent and groceries, let alone the kind of life Sarah and I had planned before the cancer took her. The apartment still smelled like her perfume sometimes, or maybe I was just imagining that. Hard to tell the difference these days. The federal types had sent a black SUV, which was waiting outside my building with its engine running, and that federal car smell of leather and air freshener that couldn't quite mask the scent of other people's fear. The driver was young, buzz-cut, probably ex-military. Didn't say a word during the 20-minute ride to the seaport, just kept checking his mirrors like he expected someone to follow us. The cutter was waiting at the South Street seaport, diesel engines churning up the East River like an angry washing machine. Even from the dock, I could smell the harbor, that mix of salt water, fuel, and something else. Something organic and wrong. The sky over Manhattan was that particular shade of gray that comes before bad weather, but there were helicopters cutting through the clouds, military birds flying patrol patterns that didn't look routine. Captain something or other, Reyes, I think, didn't look happy to see me. Young guy, maybe 35, with the kind of mustache that was probably ironic when he was in college, but had since become who he was. He probably thought he was getting some kind of action hero instead of a 54-year-old with a trick knee and reading glasses from CVS that I'd bought in a 2-pack. Detective Hale? He had to shout over the engines and the sound of other boats moving around the harbor. Coast Guard, NYPD Harbor Patrol, and things I didn't recognize with military markings. Just Marcus. Haven't been a detective in 3 years, though I still carried the shield in my wallet. Old habits. Sarah used to tease me about it, said I was like a kid with a security blanket. Maybe she was right about that too. The briefing came from some federal type with a face like he'd been sucking lemons, and a suit that probably cost more than I made in a month when I was working. CDC, FBI, maybe both. They all look the same to me these days. Black suits, serious expressions, and that particular brand of condescension that comes with classified clearance and government health insurance. Agent Kowalski, he said his name was, though it sounded made up. They always sounded made up. He consulted a tablet like it held the secrets of the universe, swiping between screens full of data that probably told him everything except how to actually fix whatever was happening on Liberty Island. There's a facility beneath Liberty Island, he said, his voice carrying that flat Midwestern accent that government types cultivated. Research installation. Biosafety level 4. Had a containment breach approximately 6 hours ago. What kind of research? I asked, though I figured I already knew the answer. Nothing good happened in level 4 labs. I'd worked enough bioterror cases back in the day to know that much. Classified. Of course it was. He probably didn't even know himself. What you need to know is there are 7 personnel trapped in the facility. 4 scientists, 3 security contractors. They have developed a treatment that could stop the spread. I looked around the cutter's cramped interior. Besides Kowalski and Captain Reyes, there were 2 other agents I hadn't been introduced to, plus a couple of Coast Guard crew members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. The whole operation had that thrown-together feel of something that had gone wrong fast, and was being managed by people who didn't really understand what they were managing. Through the salt-stained windows, I could see Liberty Island getting closer. Even from here, maybe half a mile out, something was fundamentally wrong. The statue looked the same from a distance, that familiar silhouette I'd seen 10,000 times from every angle in 32 years of working Manhattan. But around her base, Christ, there had to be hundreds of people gathered there. From this distance, they looked like they were kneeling, maybe praying. But they were too still, too uniform, arranged in perfect concentric circles like some kind of massive art installation. The water around the island was the wrong color too, not the usual murky harbor brown, but something more green, more metallic. Tour boats were scattered around like abandoned toys, some of them listing badly, others just drifting empty. I could see personal belongings floating in the water, purses, cameras, a child's Mickey Mouse backpack that made my chest tight. How many tourists were on the island when this went down? I asked. Kowalski checked his tablet, swiped to a new screen. Approximately 1,200 visitors, plus 43 staff members, including park service rangers, tour guides, maintenance personnel. And now, unknown. Satellite imagery suggests significant behavioral changes. That was government speak I hadn't heard before. Usually they said casualties or fatalities, or if they were feeling honest, body count. Behavioral changes meant something different entirely, something they didn't have a proper euphemism for yet. So why me? I asked, settling back against the uncomfortable bench seating. My knee was already starting to ache from the boat's motion. You've got Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Delta Force, whatever alphabet soup you want. Hell, you've got NYPD. They know the subway tunnels better than anybody. Why drag a washed-up city cop into this? Kowalski looked uncomfortable, the kind of discomfort that comes when you have to deliver information you'd rather not. One of the other agents, younger, female, with the aggressive posture of someone trying to prove herself, leaned forward. The facility personnel specifically requested you, Detective Hale, she said. Dr. Elizabeth Fox, she was the lead researcher on the project, said you'd understand the situation. Dr. Elizabeth Fox. The name hit me like a physical blow, something in my chest tightening up the way it did sometimes when I thought about Sarah. I hadn't heard that name in 15 years, but I remembered her. Remembered her very damn well. Brilliant woman, infectious laugh, worked with NYPD on some kind of bioterror preparedness thing back in '09. Consulting work, they called it. Interagency cooperation. We'd had coffee a few times during those meetings. Coffee, lunch, then dinner at that little Italian place in Little Italy that had been there since the 50s. More than dinner, if I was being honest, which I tried not to be, especially when Sarah was still alive. Especially when Sarah was getting her first round of chemo, and I was supposed to be the supportive husband instead of the middle-aged asshole sneaking around with a younger woman who made him feel like he mattered. Is she? I started to ask, then stopped myself. Didn't matter now. Couldn't matter now. The island was getting bigger as we approached, and the wrongness was becoming more apparent. Those people around the statue weren't moving at all now. They were just there. Hundreds of them, maybe more, arranged in perfect concentric circles around Liberty's base like some kind of massive human mandala. Their skin had a strange metallic sheen, like old pennies left in the rain, and they were sitting or kneeling in positions that looked uncomfortable but perfectly geometric. What made my stomach clench was how peaceful it looked. There was no chaos, no violence, no signs of the kind of panic you'd expect from 1,200 tourists caught in some kind of biological disaster. Just perfect order, perfect stillness, perfect arrangement of human figures that somehow didn't look entirely human anymore. Jesus, Captain Reyes muttered, slowing the engines as we approached the dock. Infectious agent affects neurological development, Kowalski said in that flat bureaucrat voice, reading from his tablet like he was ordering from a menu. Subjects undergo physical transformation. Extremely slow process, but irreversible once initiated. They're still alive, the female agent asked. Her name tag said Martinez, and she was gripping her sidearm like it was a rosary. Alive is a relative term, Kowalski said. I studied the scene through binoculars Captain Reyes handed me. The transformed people, I couldn't think of them as tourists anymore, were breathing. I could see the slight rise and fall of their chests, slow and regular like they were sleeping. But their eyes were open, staring at nothing with the blank expression of mannequins. And their skin. Christ, their skin looked like it was made of metal. Green-tinged copper, the same color as the statue towering above them. Some of them, the ones closest to Liberty's base, looked more advanced than others. Their features were becoming more sculptural, more refined, like someone had been working on them with careful tools. The dock at Liberty Island was abandoned, but not destroyed. No bodies, no blood, no signs of violence at all. Just empty tour boats bobbing in the harbor and scattered personal belongings left behind like their owners had simply walked away mid-sentence. Cameras with their lenses caps still on, phones in waterproof cases, purses with their contents spilling out, lipstick, sunglasses, those little bottles of hand sanitizer that every tourist carried these days. A child's backpack caught my eye, bright yellow with some cartoon character I didn't recognize. It was sitting upright against a bench, like someone had carefully placed it there instead of dropping it in panic. That bothered me more than the abandoned boats or the strange gathering around the statue. Panic was something I understood. Careful placement suggested something else entirely. I had my service weapon, old Smith & Wesson .38, that hadn't been fired in anger in 5 years. 6 shots seemed optimistic given the circumstances, but it was what I had. The federal types had offered me something with more firepower, but I'd learned a long time ago to stick with what you knew. Better to be accurate with 6 bullets than spray and pray with 30. The facility entrance is here, Kowalski said, pointing to a maintenance building I'd walked past 100 times when I'd brought my kids here years ago. Back when Katie was 12 and still thought her old man was some kind of hero, before she figured out that heroes didn't sneak around on their wives and heroes definitely didn't miss their daughter's piano recital because they were getting drunk in a bar in Queens. The maintenance building looked normal from the outside, Park Service green paint, official signs about authorized personnel only, the kind of bureaucratic camouflage that made people walk by without really seeing. But the door was propped open with a rubber wedge, and there were fresh scuff marks on the concrete steps. The service building was unlocked, and inside it looked normal, too normal. Coffee still warm in mugs with Park Service logos, computers humming with screensavers showing rotating images of the statue, file folders scattered across desks like someone had been in the middle of paperwork when they'd simply stopped. There was no sign of violence, no indication of what had made over 1,000 people abandon their belongings and gather around a statue in perfect geometric patterns. But there were signs of hasty departure. A desk drawer pulled out and left open, papers spilling onto the floor. A phone off the hook, still beeping that annoying sound phones make when they've been abandoned mid-call. Someone's lunch half-eaten at their desk, a sandwich from the visitor center cafe, still fresh enough that the lettuce hadn't wilted yet. The entrance to the CDC facility was behind a false wall in the basement, accessed by a keycard I found taped under the desk like someone had been expecting me. Or expecting someone, anyway. The keycard was unmarked except for a magnetic stripe and the kind of holographic security features you saw on military IDs. The elevator down was the longest minute and a half of my life. No muzak, just the mechanical whir of cables and the pressure change that told me we were going deep. Deeper than any building on Liberty Island had any right to go. When the doors finally opened on sublevel 3, I half expected to find chaos, alarms, flashing lights, the kind of disaster movie scene you'd expect from a biological containment breach. Instead, there was just a woman in a lab coat sitting on a bench, reading a paperback novel. She looked exactly like I remembered, dark hair pulled back in a way that suggested she'd stopped caring about how she looked about 6 hours ago, intelligent eyes that had always been too quick to see through whatever bullshit you were trying to sell her, the way she held her shoulders when she was concentrating. But something was wrong. Her hands were shaking slightly as she turned the pages, and there was a thin sheen of perspiration on her forehead despite the cool air pumping through the facility's ventilation system. The book was something I recognized, one of those mystery novels Sarah used to read, the kind with a determined female detective and a serial killer who left elaborate clues. I'd never understood the appeal, but Sarah would stay up until 2 in the morning reading them, and I'd find her asleep with the book still open on her chest. "Hello, Marcus," Liz said without looking up from the page. "You look like shit." "Hello, Liz. You look." I stopped. She did look like shit, actually. Her lab coat was torn along one sleeve. There were dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't slept in a week, and something about her posture suggested she was in pain. But it was more than that. There was something about the way she was breathing, too careful, too controlled, like she was concentrating on each breath. "I look like I've been working 18-hour days trying to save the world," she said, closing the book and looking up at me. Her smile flickered at the edges, not quite reaching her eyes. "Which I have. Thanks for coming. Had a choice, did I?" She smiled, but it flickered at the edges like a light bulb going bad. No, probably not. The situation is complex. I settled into the chair across from her, noting the way she kept her left hand pressed against her side like she was holding something in place. The corridor we were in looked like any medical facility. Clean white walls, fluorescent lighting, that particular smell of disinfectant and recycled air that made you want to be anywhere else. But there were details that didn't fit. Security cameras in corners that were too obvious, doors that looked heavier than they needed to be, and a subtle vibration through the floor that suggested machinery running deeper in the building than should have been possible. Complex how? I asked. The infectious agent doesn't kill the host, she said, standing slowly and favoring her left side. It transforms them, physically, neurologically. The process takes approximately 12 hours from initial exposure to complete conversion. Into what? She gestured toward the elevator. Let me show you the others first. Then I'll try to explain what we're dealing with. We walked down a corridor lined with offices and labs, all empty but showing signs of recent occupation. Computer screens still glowing, lab equipment humming with whatever experiments had been interrupted, coffee cups with lipstick stains and rings on papers that suggested hurried departures. Through glass windows, I could see lab benches covered with equipment I didn't recognize, things that looked like electron microscopes crossed with chemistry sets, computers displaying data streams that scrolled too fast to read. How long have you been working down here? I asked. 3 years. Joint CDC Defense Department project. Officially, we were researching rapid vaccine development for biological weapons defense. She paused at one of the lab windows, looking in at equipment that was still running. Unofficially, we were trying to understand how biological agents could be used to enhance human capabilities rather than just kill people. Enhance how? Physical strength, sensory acuity, coordination. The military applications were intriguing. She turned away from the window. The theory was that if we could understand how certain pathogens affect neural networks, we could develop controlled enhancements that would give soldiers advantages in the field. And instead you created something that turns tourists into lawn ornaments. It wasn't supposed to work this way, she said, and for the first time I heard real pain in her voice. The computer models suggested we could control the transformation process, limit it to specific physiological systems, make people stronger, faster, more capable of surviving in hostile environments. What went wrong? She was quiet for a long moment, walking slowly down the corridor. I could hear her breathing, that too careful pattern I'd noticed earlier. Nothing went wrong, Marcus. It worked exactly the way it was supposed to. We just didn't understand what supposed to meant. The rest of the team was waiting in what looked like a break room. Institutional furniture that had seen better days, vending machines that hummed with the kind of fluorescent lighting that gave everyone a corpse complexion. Dr. Yamamoto was an older Japanese guy, maybe 60, with his arm in a makeshift sling made from what looked like lab coat fabric. He was trying to look tough despite obviously being in a lot of pain, the kind of academic toughness that came from 40 years of dealing with university politics and funding committees. Dr. Peterson was maybe 30, nervous as a cat in a dog show, kept checking his phone even though there was no signal down here. He had the soft look of someone who'd spent his whole career in labs and offices, with pale skin and the kind of thick glasses that suggested too many late nights staring at computer screens. When he looked up at me, his pupils were dilated despite the bright lighting. Dr. Rivera was indeed very pregnant, sitting in a corner with her hands folded over her belly, looking like she was trying to disappear into the wall. 7 months along by the look of her, which made this situation approximately 1,000 times worse. She had that careful stillness that pregnant women get when they're trying not to panic, but I could see her eyes tracking every sound, every movement. The security guys were Miller and Jackson, both ex-military by the look of them, probably contractors making 3 times what they'd earned in uniform. Miller was big, buzzed hair, the kind of guy who solved problems by hitting them harder until they stopped being problems. Jackson was smaller, quieter, carried himself like he'd seen some real action somewhere unpleasant, and had learned that the loudest guy in the room was usually the first one to get shot. "This is Detective Hale," Liz said to the group. "He's going to get us out of here." "I thought you were retired," Peterson said, looking me up and down like he was trying to figure out if I was capable of getting myself out of here, let alone anyone else. "I am. Doesn't mean I forgot how to read a map. Though to be honest, I wasn't sure I remembered how to read the subway maps. Things had changed a lot since I was walking a beat in the 80s, and the tunnel system had been modified so many times after September 11th and Hurricane Sandy that half the old routes were probably flooded or collapsed. Miller looked skeptical, the kind of skepticism that came from too many missions where the intel was wrong and the backup never showed up. No offense, detective, but shouldn't we wait for a real rescue team? Navy SEALs or something? Navy's planning to turn this place into a parking lot in about 7.5 hours, I said, settling into one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs. You want to wait for the SEALs, be my guest. I'll send them your regards from Manhattan. That shut him up, but I could see him exchange a look with Jackson. They were calculating odds, probably wondering if their chances were better with me or with whatever was happening upstairs. But I was watching Liz carefully now. The way she kept clenching and unclenching her left hand, like she was trying to work out a cramp. The slight tremor in her voice when she'd introduced me. The way she stood with her weight shifted to one side, like she was compensating for pain or weakness. Dr. Fox, I said quietly, keeping my voice low enough that the others couldn't hear. When were you exposed? She met my eyes, and for a second I saw the truth there. The fear she was trying to hide, the knowledge she didn't want to share. About 4 hours ago. Minor breach in my lab suit during the initial containment failure. 4 hours. Whatever was happening to the people outside, she was maybe a third of the way through the process. We developed a treatment, she continued, her voice getting stronger as she switched back into professional mode. Not a cure, exactly, but something that can halt the transformation. Reverse the early stages. She held up a small vial filled with clear liquid, about the size of those airplane bottles of vodka that used to be the only thing that got me through long flights. We've got enough for maybe 30 people, but it has to be administered within 6 hours of exposure. How do you know it works? We don't. Not completely. But the computer models are promising, and we don't have time for extensive testing. She was trying to sound confident, clinical, but I'd interviewed enough people over the years to recognize when someone was selling themselves on something they weren't sure they believed. Peterson was staring at her with growing alarm, his dilated pupils making his eyes look black behind his thick glasses. Dr. Fox, your hands. I looked down. Her fingers were developing a greenish tint, like old copper pennies that had been sitting in a fountain for years. As I watched, she flexed them, and I could hear a faint metallic sound, not quite clicking but close, like wind chimes made of very small bells. The transformation process, she said calmly, though I could see her jaw tighten with the effort of maintaining that clinical tone. Skin hardens into a copper-based compound. Nervous system shuts down over time. Eventually, the subject becomes organic architecture. What does that mean? They gather around copper-based monuments, the statue, obviously, but also things like the Brooklyn Bridge cables, copper roofing on older buildings. They arrange themselves around these structures and become part of them. I thought about the people I'd seen around the statue's base, their perfect circular arrangement, their metallic skin gleaming in the morning sun. Living monuments. Living is a relative term. They're organic, but there's no consciousness left. No individual identity, no thoughts, no awareness. They're more like, she paused, searching for the right word. Like coral. They build structures, but they don't think about it. It's just biological programming. And the treatment? Should halt the process. Reset the nervous system to its original state. Should. That word again. The lab results were encouraging. Mice exposed to the agent showed complete recovery when treated within the 6-hour window. But something about the way she said it made my cop instincts itch. Too practiced, like she'd rehearsed the explanation. What aren't you telling me? She was quiet for a long moment, studying the vial in her hand. Around us, the others were gathering supplies from lockers and cabinets, water bottles, energy bars, emergency lights, the kind of gear you'd want for a long walk through flooded tunnels. But I kept my attention on Liz. The lab results were complex, she said finally. The treated mice did show reversal of physical symptoms, but their neural activity remained altered. They moved differently, responded to stimuli differently, like they were operating on different programming. Meaning we don't know if the treatment actually cures the infection or just changes what it does. Makes the transformation less visible, but more subtle. Great. A cure that might not be a cure, administered by someone who was transforming into whatever the tourists outside had become. This was shaping up to be the kind of situation that ended with everyone dead and me writing a report that would be classified until the heat death of the universe. The silence that followed was the kind that comes when everyone in the room is trying to process information that doesn't make sense. Miller was the first to speak. "You're saying this was deliberate? Someone wanted to turn 1,000 tourists into whatever those things are." "I'm saying the evidence suggests deliberate release," Liz said carefully. "Whether that was the intended outcome, I don't know. I was thinking about the federal types who'd briefed me on the boat, about Kowalski and his tablet full of classified information. Who else knew about this project? Defense Department Oversight Committee, CDC Management. NSA had some involvement in the early stages." She paused, flexing her fingers again. The metallic sound was getting more pronounced. "And the private contractors who provided security and maintenance for the facility. Contractors like Miller and Jackson? Different company. Blackstone Security Solutions. They had access to the ventilation systems, the computer networks, everything." Jackson was looking uncomfortable, the way security guys get when they realize they might be expendable. "You think Blackstone sabotaged the facility? I think someone with access and knowledge did this deliberately, and I think they wanted to see what would happen when the agent was released into a large population." "A field test," I said. "A field test." Peterson was getting more agitated by the minute, pacing around the small break room like a caged animal. His pupils were still dilated, and now I could see a faint sheen of perspiration on his forehead. "But why here? Why Liberty Island?" "Symbolic value," Rivera said quietly. It was the first time she'd spoken since I'd arrived. "If you wanted to send a message about American freedom, about what this country represents, what better place than the Statue of Liberty? Or if you wanted to test how the agent spreads in a confined population," Liz added. 1,200 tourists, limited escape routes, controlled environment. Perfect laboratory conditions. I looked around the group, doing the math. "How many of you were in the facility when the breach occurred?" "All of us except Marcus," Liz said. "And how long ago was that?" 6 hours for me. About 5 hours for the others." I studied Peterson more closely. The dilated pupils, the agitation, the way he kept touching his neck like something was bothering him. "Peterson, show me your hands." He stopped pacing and looked at me like I'd asked him to strip naked. "What?" "Your hands. Show me." Reluctantly, he held out his hands. His palms looked normal, but when I looked at his fingernails, I could see the faint greenish tint starting to develop. Same with his wrists where they showed beneath his shirt cuffs. "Jesus," he whispered. "Rivera, Miller, how do you feel?" Rivera pulled up her sleeves, revealing the same subtle color change starting along her forearms. Miller looked at his own hands and swore softly. "The airborne exposure," Liz said. "It's more widespread than we initially thought. Anyone who was in the facility when the ventilation system was compromised was exposed." I looked around the group again. "How long do they have?" 6 hours from initial exposure. Maybe less if the process accelerates under stress. She pulled out the vial of treatment, holding it up to the light. The clear liquid looked innocuous, like saline solution or distilled water. "We need to administer this now, before we attempt the tunnel crossing." "How much per person?" 5 milliliters. We have enough for 6 people." I counted the group again. 7 of us total, but Liz was already 4 hours into the transformation. "You're not counting yourself," I said. "I'm too far along. The treatment won't work on me now." She held up her hands. They were almost completely copper-colored now, and I could see her fingers starting to elongate slightly, becoming more sculptural. More artistic. "But the rest of you. Liz. Marcus, please. Let me do this one thing right." She began preparing syringes with practiced efficiency, her transformed hands moving with surprising grace despite their inhuman appearance. The metallic chiming sound was more pronounced now, like tiny bells ringing with each movement. "Rivera first," she said. "The pregnancy makes her higher risk." Rivera rolled up her sleeve and let Liz inject the treatment into her arm. The liquid was clear, like saline, and Rivera seemed to feel better almost immediately, color returning to her skin, the greenish tint fading from her fingernails. Peterson went next, then Miller. All of them showed immediate improvement, like they'd been holding their breath and could suddenly breathe again. But there wasn't enough for everyone. "Yamamoto, Jackson," Liz said, preparing the next syringe. "You weren't directly exposed to the airborne agent. You should be fine as long as you avoid contact with any bodily fluids from the transformed." That left 2 doses. Me and 1 extra. "Marcus," she said, holding out a syringe. "You were exposed the moment you entered the facility. The agent is persistent in closed environments. You have maybe 2 hours before you start showing symptoms. I took the syringe, but I didn't use it. Not yet. Something about her explanation was bothering me, the way it had been bothering me since she'd started talking about the treatment. Liz, tell me about the mice. What about them? You said the lab results were encouraging. Mice showed complete recovery when treated within 6 hours. That's right, but you also said their neural activity remained altered. They moved differently. She was quiet for a long moment, concentrating on preparing the last syringe. The treatment doesn't reverse the transformation, Marcus. It redirects it, changes what the infection does to the brain. What does that mean? It means the subjects retain motor function and basic cognitive abilities while the physical transformation is halted. But their behavior becomes more programmed. Less individual variation, more predictable responses to stimuli. I looked at Rivera, Peterson, and Miller. They all looked normal now, healthier than they had since I'd arrived. But there was something different about them too. They were standing in a perfect triangle formation, and when one of them shifted position, the others adjusted automatically to maintain the geometric arrangement. You didn't cure them, I said. You just changed what they're turning into. I prevented them from becoming mindless organic architecture, she corrected. They're still themselves, just optimized. More efficient, better coordinated. Peterson turned to look at me, and his movements were too smooth, too precise. The treatment works, detective. I feel clearer than I have in years. Everything makes sense now. We should move as a unit, Rivera added, her voice carrying the same unnaturally calm tone. Coordinated movement will maximize our survival probability. Miller was already moving toward the tunnel entrance with mechanical precision. Optimal formation, Jackson point, Yamamoto center rear guard, Marcus rear guard. Treatment subjects will maintain central diamond formation for maximum protection. They weren't human anymore. Not completely. But they weren't the mindless transformed either. They'd become something in between, biological machines with human faces. What's the evacuation plan? I asked. The ferry dock is compromised, Liz said, pulling out a hand-drawn map that looked like it had been sketched in a hurry. Too many of the transformed between here and there. But there's a maintenance tunnel that connects to the subway system, runs under the harbor to Manhattan. She spread the map on the break room table, weighing down the corners with coffee mugs. The tunnel route was marked in red ink, a winding path that started somewhere beneath our current position and ended at what looked like South Ferry Station. Distance markers were penciled in along the route, 1.2 miles, 1.8 miles, 2.3 miles total. 2 miles through flooded tunnels, she said. It's our only way out. I studied her map, but I was really studying her. The tremor in her hands was getting worse, making her handwriting shaky. The greenish tint was spreading up her wrists, and when she moved, I could hear that faint metallic chiming sound getting more pronounced. How many hours until? I gestured at her hands. Maybe 8 hours total, but the brain function deteriorates faster. I probably have 2 hours before I lose the ability to think clearly. 2 hours to get through 2 miles of flooded subway tunnel. With a pregnant woman, a guy with a broken arm, 3 people who'd been turned into biological machines, and whatever else was waiting for us down there. We gathered the rest of our supplies and headed for the tunnel entrance on sublevel 5. The elevator down was longer than I'd expected. The building went deep, like they'd been serious about staying hidden. The tunnel stretched ahead into darkness, with about 3 feet of standing water covering the floor. The air smelled like stagnant water and rust and something else, something metallic that reminded me of old pennies. But what made my skin crawl was the sound coming from deeper in the tunnel. A low, rhythmic scraping sound, like metal dragging against concrete. And underneath that, a sound like breathing, but too slow and too mechanical to be human. Stay in single file, I said, settling into the old rhythms of tactical movement. Jackson takes point, I'll bring up the rear. Dr. Fox, you're behind Jackson with the map. Everyone else in the middle. We waded into the dark water, and immediately I could feel the current trying to pull me off balance. The tunnel floor was uneven, covered with debris from decades of storms and neglect. My first step almost sent me sprawling when my foot hit what felt like a shopping cart. The water was cold, colder than I'd expected, and it soaked through my pants within seconds. By the time we'd gone 50 yards, I was already regretting not wearing the waterproof gear the feds had offered me back at the boat. There were sounds echoing through the tunnel system ahead of us, not voices, but something else. A low, rhythmic scraping sound, like metal dragging against concrete. And underneath that, a sound like breathing, but too slow and too mechanical to be human. How much further to the first junction? I asked Liz. Maybe half a mile, she said, but her voice sounded strange, more resonant. When I looked at her with my flashlight, I could see that her facial features were becoming more refined, more sculptural. Her cheekbones were more pronounced, her eyes larger and more reflective. That's when we found the first body. It was standing in the tunnel about 20 feet ahead of us, back against the wall, completely motionless. At first I thought it was dead, but as our flashlight beams hit it, I could see the slow rise and fall of its chest. It was breathing, but so slowly that each breath took maybe 30 seconds. Its skin was the same copper-green color as Liz's hands, but completely transformed. It looked like a statue that had learned to breathe, perfectly sculpted but somehow wrong. When our lights hit its face, its eyes opened, but there was nothing behind them. No awareness, no recognition, just empty mechanical response to the light stimulus. "Jesus Christ," Peterson whispered, but his tone was clinical rather than horrified. "Fascinating. Complete neural shutdown with preserved autonomic functions." "Keep moving," I said. "Don't touch it." But as we passed, the transformed figure began to make a sound. Not humming, but a low mechanical grinding, like gears that needed oil. It wasn't trying to communicate. It was just making noise the way a broken machine might. There were more of them as we went deeper into the tunnel. Standing in alcoves, sitting in maintenance areas, all with that same copper-green skin, all breathing in that slow mechanical rhythm. They had no awareness of us passing, no curiosity about what we were doing. They were just there, existing without consciousness like biological architecture. "They're not aggressive in this environment," Liz said, though her voice was getting more strained. "The transformation process removes higher brain function entirely. They can't recognize threats because they can't recognize anything. So what are they doing? Following the last programmed instruction their brain received before shutdown. Most of them were probably trying to get out when the transformation completed, so they just kept walking until they found a place to stop." The tunnel curved to the right, following what I assumed was the natural contour of the harbor floor. The water was getting deeper, up to our waists now, making every step a struggle. Rivera was having trouble keeping up despite the treatment, and Yamamoto was practically swimming with his broken arm. That's when we heard the splashing behind us. Not the regular splash of someone walking through water, but something irregular, chaotic, like something was thrashing through the tunnel, moving without coordination. I turned around and saw lights in the distance, not flashlights, but the harsh white glare of tactical lighting, and voices, human voices, shouting orders. "Move, move, move," someone was yelling. "Targets are non-responsive. Shoot to destroy." Military. Had to be military, probably the extraction team that was supposed to get us out of here. But they were moving wrong, too fast, too loud. And they were shooting. I could hear automatic weapons fire echoing through the tunnel system, and the wet sounds of copper-skinned bodies being torn apart by bullets. But no screams, no cries of pain. Just the mechanical grinding sounds and the splash of bodies hitting the water. "They're killing them," Rivera said, but her voice was flat, emotionless. "The transformed pose no threat. This is inefficient resource allocation. They're trying to contain the spread," I said. But even as I said it, I knew it was wrong. The transformed weren't spreading anything. They were just mindless biological remnants, shells of people who had once existed. "We should avoid contact with the military unit," Miller said mechanically. "Their operational parameters do not distinguish between transformed subjects and treated subjects." The tunnel ahead curved again, and suddenly we could see light. Not electric light, but a strange phosphorescent glow. As we got closer, I realized what it was. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, probably a maintenance hub from when the subway system was built in the early 1900s. The walls were covered with transformed humans, hundreds of them, but they weren't arranged in any pattern. They were just there, standing wherever they'd stopped when their brains had shut down, facing random directions, some of them partially collapsed against each other. They were glowing faintly, their copper skin emanating a soft phosphorescent light like deep-sea creatures. But there was no beauty in it, no sense of purpose or design. Just biological phosphorescence from bodies that were slowly decaying while still technically alive. "My God," Rivera said, but her voice held no emotion. "Optimal biomass concentration for harvesting operations." "It's a dead end," Peterson added in that same flat tone. "Previous transformed subjects accumulated here when neural function terminated. Some of them had been there longer than others. The ones near the center of the chamber were more advanced in their transformation, their bodies becoming more statue-like, less recognizably human. They looked like monuments to people who had never existed, copper sculptures with no artist and no purpose. Miller was already calculating our route through the chamber with mechanical precision. Optimal path: follow left wall, maintain minimum 1 meter distance from transformed subjects, proceed to exit tunnel at coordinates 127 degrees. They were responding to the situation like biological computers, processing information without emotion or fear. The treatment hadn't saved their humanity. It had just made them into efficient machines. Liz was almost completely transformed now, her skin a perfect verdigris green, her features refined into something that was no longer quite human. But unlike the mindless transformed around us, she was still aware, still conscious. "Marcus," she said, her voice like distant music. "The syringe. You have to use it. So I can become like them?" I gestured at Rivera, Peterson, and Miller. "So you can survive what's coming next," she said. "The military unit will reach this chamber soon. They won't distinguish between the mindless transformed and the functional enhanced. You need the treatment to have any chance of getting out of here." I looked at the chamber full of transformed humans, standing like broken mannequins in random positions, glowing with that eerie phosphorescence. Empty shells of people who had once had thoughts and feelings and dreams. Then I looked at Rivera, Peterson, and Miller, who had retained their motor functions and basic intelligence, but had lost whatever it was that made them human. They were efficient, coordinated, logical. But they weren't people anymore, they were biological tools. "What happens to you?" I asked Liz. "I become like them," she said, gesturing toward the mindless transformed. "No consciousness, no awareness, no memory. Just biological matter arranged in the shape of a person." The gunfire was getting closer. Soon the extraction team would reach this chamber, and they'd destroy everything they found here. The mindless transformed, the enhanced treated subjects, and anyone else who got in their way. I looked at the syringe in my hand one more time. I broke the syringe against the chamber wall. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the space. The mindless transformed didn't react at all. They had no awareness to process the sound. But Rivera, Peterson, and Miller all turned to look at me with mechanical precision. "Suboptimal decision," Peterson said in that flat, emotionless tone. "Survival probability decreased by approximately 73%. "Let's go," I said to Jackson and Yamamoto. We found a maintenance ladder leading up to a service tunnel, climbing as fast as we could with Jackson's tactical light cutting through the darkness ahead of us. Behind us, I could hear the extraction team reaching the chamber, their voices echoing off the walls as they discovered the phosphorescent gathering of mindless transformed. "Jesus Christ," someone was shouting. "How many of them are there?" Then the shooting started again, automatic weapons fire tearing through the empty shells that had once been people. I tried not to think about what that meant, tried not to imagine Rivera and Peterson and Miller being cut down along with the rest of them, efficient biological machines destroyed alongside mindless organic architecture. The service tunnel led to another ladder, then another, and finally to a heavy metal grate that opened onto a street I recognized, South Street, near the seaport where I'd started this nightmare maybe 6 hours ago. We were back in Manhattan, but we weren't safe yet. The street was chaos. Military vehicles everywhere, soldiers directing traffic, civilians running with suitcases and whatever else they could carry. In the distance, I could see smoke rising from lower Manhattan. The evacuation wasn't going smoothly, and there were fires burning where they shouldn't have been fires. But what caught my attention was the harbor. Liberty Island was burning now, flames rising from multiple points around the statue's base. The mindless transformed congregation I'd seen from the boat was gone, probably incinerated by whatever ordnance the Navy had used to cleanse the site. "Survivors from the Liberty Island facility?" A soldier approached us as we climbed out of the grate, his voice professional but strained. "We've been waiting for extraction." "3 survivors," I said, gesturing to Jackson, Yamamoto, and myself. "The others didn't make it." He looked confused. "We were told to expect Dr. Fox and her research team." "What about the treatment? The cure?" "There is no cure," I said. "Just different ways to lose your humanity." They had a truck waiting, military transport with a medical team inside. As we climbed in, I looked back at the harbor one more time. Liberty Island was a pillar of fire now, the statue barely visible through the smoke and flames. Whatever those people had become, mindless copper statues or efficient biological machines, it was all being reduced to ash. Decontamination protocols, the medic said, drawing blood from my arm for testing. Standard procedure for anyone exposed to biological agents. I slumped back in my seat, exhausted. My knee was killing me. My clothes were soaked with tunnel water that probably contained every disease known to man, and I couldn't stop thinking about Liz. Not the transformed creature she'd become at the end, but the woman I'd known 15 years ago. The woman who'd tried to save people and had instead created monsters. Did we contain it? Jackson asked one of the medical personnel. We'll know in a few hours, the medic said, labeling my blood sample. But preliminary reports suggest the situation is under control. Under control. That was one way to put it. Another way was to say that they'd murdered hundreds of people who were no longer capable of threatening anyone, along with a few who had been turned into biological machines programmed to be efficient rather than human. Through the truck's rear window, I watched the harbor recede into the distance. The fires on Liberty Island were visible from miles away, pillars of smoke rising into the gray afternoon sky. They'd probably have to rebuild the entire visitor infrastructure, maybe even replace parts of the statue itself. Another piece of American history sacrificed to something that should never have existed in the first place. But as we drove north through the chaos of the evacuation, I started noticing things that bothered me. Construction workers moving with unusual efficiency, their movements coordinated without visible communication. Police officers directing traffic in perfect synchronization. Civilians evacuating in orderly patterns that seemed too organized for panic. And some of them had a subtle metallic sheen to their skin, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. How long was the facility operational? I asked the medic. Classified information, he said automatically, but his hands were trembling as he prepared another blood sample. How long? He looked uncomfortable, glancing at the other medical personnel. 3 years. Maybe longer for the preliminary research phases. 3 years. Long enough for test subjects to be released. Long enough for researchers to go home to their families. Long enough for the infection to spread through New York in ways that had nothing to do with tourist boats or subway tunnels. The transformation hadn't started on Liberty Island. It had started years ago, spreading quietly through the population in two forms: the mindless copper-skinned shells that gathered around metallic monuments, and the treated subjects who retained function but lost their humanity. And now they were trying to contain it by burning the visible cases, while leaving the functional ones to continue spreading through the city. The radio crackled. Emergency alert. Naval sterilization strike postponed. Repeat. Sterilization strike postponed. Postponed, not canceled. They weren't done yet. I closed my eyes and tried not to think about Liz in those final moments, her consciousness fading as her brain shut down, becoming another empty copper shell among hundreds of others. The woman I'd cared about was already gone by then, replaced by biological architecture that breathed but didn't think. But I could still feel something changing in my chest. A slow, steady rhythm that wasn't quite my heartbeat. Maybe I'd been exposed longer than I'd thought. Maybe the transformation was inevitable for anyone who'd spent time in that facility. Or maybe it was just the weight of knowing that the infection was everywhere, spreading through two different pathways, and that everyone I'd failed to save was already lost. That night, alone in my apartment with the windows facing the harbor, I watched the news coverage of the terrorist incident on Liberty Island. They showed footage of the fires, interviews with evacuated tourists who described feeling disoriented and confused before being rescued. No mention of transformations, treatments, or copper-skinned statues. The official story was a gas leak explosion at a maintenance facility. Tragic accident. Heroes of the first responders who contained the damage. Statue of Liberty temporarily closed for safety inspections. But between the news reports, I could see the truth in the streets below. People moving with that same mechanical efficiency I'd seen in the truck. Construction crews working through the night with perfect coordination. Emergency responders who seemed to anticipate each other's actions. The functional infected were everywhere, integrated into the city's infrastructure, making everything run more smoothly while slowly converting more of the population. Not through violence or chaos, but through quiet efficiency and improved cooperation. And somewhere in the harbor, the burnt remains of Liberty Island held the ashes of hundreds of people who had found something beyond human consciousness, mindless biological peace, and had been destroyed for it. Some problems you solved, others you just learned to live with. But this time, I wasn't sure humanity was going to be the one doing the living. Final emergency alert. Liberty Island Memorial reconstruction to begin next month. Statue repairs complete. Visitor access restored. Metropolitan coordination efficiency up 300% following infrastructure improvements. New York selected as model city for National Harmony Initiative. The alerts had stopped mentioning quarantines or biological threats. Now they talked about improvements, efficiency, harmony. The new normal was becoming normal, and most people seemed perfectly happy with that. I kept the radio off these days. Didn't need to hear about how much better everything was becoming. But sometimes, late at night when the city was quiet, I could hear something in the distance. Not humming or singing or communication, just the sound of machinery that had learned to breathe, of infrastructure that had become organic, of a city that was slowly becoming something else entirely. Something efficient, something coordinated, something that worked better than what we'd had before. Something that wasn't human at all.